Okay. Marco, I'm still meeting people, but we are almost ready.
Okay.
Let's wait for a few more because now we are in total 39. So I think that we still miss, yeah, here we have another one. Okay. If everyone is online, we should be more than 50 people connected. So we are now 41. Guys, if you want to say hello to the speakers and switch on your video for a while before we go live, feel free to do it.
Maybe a good time to take a picture, actually.
Great to see everybody.
Yeah, you're right, Humberto. Okay. Okay, so 1 minute left before we go live. Okay, so a few last people that are joining us. Okay, Marco, we go live in 5 seconds.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final session of the Summer School on Business and Human Rights. We had 5 days of work dealing with some of the most important issues in the field of business and human rights, such as the content and implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the 3 pillars of the UNGPs, and we dealt with specific contemporary topics which are feeding the debate on business and human rights nowadays: climate change and business and human rights, labor exploitation in the supply chains, the gender divide in the contemporary system of production, as well as the big data and the impact of technological development on human rights. Now we are approaching the conclusion of this 3rd edition of the summer school, and the final roundtable is going to be preceded by a recorded video message from Professor Anita Ramasastry and Fabrizio Petri. Let me introduce Professor Ramasastry and Fabrizio Petri. Anita Ramasastry is Professor of Law and Director of the Sustainable International Development Graduate Program at the School of Law of University of Washington. We are really proud having the possibility to host Professor Ramasastry in this edition of the summer school. Of course, and as you know, Professor Ramasastry is one of the leading academicians in this field area. She's a pioneer in the field of business and human rights. She has extensively published in this area, and her work has inspired a generation of business and human rights lawyers. She serves since 2016 in quality of member of the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and as to the 1st of July, she is the chair of the working group. Fabrizio Petri is an Italian diplomat, is minister plenipotentiary, and from the 1st September 2016, Fabrizio Petri has been appointed as the chairman of the Inter-ministerial Committee for Human Rights, the body dealing with human rights issues within Italian public administration. And it is just under the direction of Fabrizio Petri that the committee, the Inter-ministerial Committee, has developed the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, launched in 2016, some years ago. So let's start with the video message from Professor Ramasastry.
I'm Professor Anita Ramasastry. I'm the current chair of the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and I'm also a law professor at the University of Washington. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this 3rd Business and Human Rights Summer School and congratulate you for taking this important step in learning about a topic that I think is vital and critical to our understanding of how to protect people and the planet for the next decade to come. Now, why is business and human rights important? I'm passionate about it. I've been working in this field for more than 2 decades, and I understand its importance, but I hope that you too will become evangelists for this subject as well. We only have to look at the crisis we're in now, the pandemic and COVID-19, to begin to understand that corporate impacts on people are an important issue that we need to all address in terms of corporate accountability. As we think about the issue of global supply chains and workers who are making masks in factories somewhere around the world that may be subject to poor worker conditions. If we think about Black Lives Matter and the whole issue of racial discrimination in the US and elsewhere, we also need to understand that companies have profited from slavery over the decades and actually now engage in their own discrimination within the workplace. So there are many, many issues and they continue to come up. So it's important for all of us to change our mindset. That's my first important point, which is just to say business and human rights is so important. Some of you are going to have careers in this field. You're going to go on to be academics. You're going to work for civil society organizations, and you really want to focus on business and human rights and corporate responsibility. Others of you are going to go off and deal with other issues, whether it's working with indigenous communities, working within a company on sustainability and the environment. But it's really important to have as part of your toolkit this topic or understanding of business and human rights. My second point for today is really that business and human rights is not the same thing as corporate social responsibility. And you're going to hear about that from your excellent faculty this week. CSR is a voluntary movement around companies deciding what they're going to do, deciding to donate masks to a hospital. But that's not what business and human rights is about. Fundamentally, business and human rights is a mind shift. It's about thinking about the impacts and harms that business activity create and cause to people all over the world. And that's the issue that we're really focusing on, not what a company chooses to do voluntarily. Similarly, you may hear terms during this course like ESG, environmental, social, and governance. These are indicators that investors use. The S or social is not exactly the same. So I want you to really understand that BHR is more than a topic or a subject. It's about shifting our own mindset and helping policymakers and governments and business shift their mindset too. My other point is that you really need to step back and understand the historical context of this whole area or movement. Business and human rights didn't just begin with the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and you're going to hear so much about that over the course of this summer school. But the Guiding Principles were built on many other documents, many other fights, and many other issues that existed for decades before, really starting after the World War II, decolonization, and the role of transnational corporations becoming even more important in a globalized economy. So we can look back to the 60s, to the 70s, to struggles between corporations, home states, host states. You're going to learn a lot about that. And into the 90s, when we had our first examples of sweatshop labor in factories in Southeast Asia and other places. So one of the things just to understand is that this is a trajectory, and we're looking at different moments in time. And the Guiding Principles is the culmination of many other struggles and many other ideological battles. And so really understanding that we're still on a journey and that it's not just one point in time. The other thing I want to say is that there's no either or. You're also going to hear about now, today. Right? The Guiding Principles have been around for almost a decade. Right? 2011, the Human Rights Council endorses them. But we also have other processes underway in the Human Rights Council. There is a negotiation that's going on now for a so-called binding treaty on business and human rights, led by the government of Ecuador. And some states are participating, others aren't. It's a very interesting phenomenon. But some people will tell you it's an either or. We don't need the Guiding Principles or we don't need the treaty. But the issue here is, and I hope you will understand through what you're going to learn in this rich summer school, that we need so many solutions, right? That the larger challenge is that corporations still are not as accountable as they could be, as responsible, that voluntarism has not worked over the past decade. The Guiding Principles are an important step, and they are leading to regulation and leading to government action, so they're an important piece of a larger recipe. A treaty is something that will hold governments to account and is a good mechanism for forcing state change. But all of these things are necessary for what is the key reason we have business and human rights as a movement, which is access to remedy, access to effective remedy for rights holders or victims who are impacted by corporate conduct. Those rights holders are all over the world. Sometimes they're in the global south, but as we see with COVID-19, they could be factory workers anywhere in the world. They could be Uber drivers, right? That we really need to just understand that those individuals, A, need to be protected in the first place. We need to prevent business and human rights related abuses, but B, they need remedy. When something happens to them, they cannot be left without resource or without recourse. And that is the larger challenge. And many of your faculty are going to talk about this challenge. So to me, there's no either or. We need multiple solutions, and we need new solutions as well. So I'll conclude my remarks there by just saying that I think that it's wonderful that you're engaged in the summer school. Your faculty is excellent. I know many of them, and they have all written and thought about these topics deeply from different perspectives. So I look forward to and hope that I get a chance to meet many of you in the future, and that you will commit yourself to making things better and standing up for corporate accountability. Thank you.
Many thanks to Professor Ramasastry for the video message. Let me highlight 2 points which are really important to me, and that may also feed the debate of the roundtable. The first one is the fact that business and human rights is not the same of corporate social responsibility. It's not the same of CSR. Indeed, in the current debate, there is an inclination to a tendency to equate UNGPs, and in particular corporate responsibility to respect, to CSR strategies. But unfortunately, CSR strategies miss the crucial point of the UNGPs on the corporate, or the second pillar, that is the necessity that companies prevent their negative impact on human rights by implementing ad hoc processes, and also miss the consequences stemming from this kind of duty in terms of acting for remediate that negative impact. The second point that I think deserves to be highlighted in the Professor Ramasastry speech is the mechanism, the centrality of the mechanism of remedies. This is really a fundamental issue. We need effective remedies in addition to the prevention. According to a Roman law brocardo, ubi ius ibi remedium, in English, in common law, in the common law, where is a right, there is a remedy. This means that once a right is established, we need that right holders have a remedy to point in order to enforce these rights. And unfortunately, in these 10 years since their adoption, the debate has been focused on the first pillar, the state duty to protect, on the second pillar, the corporate responsibility to respect, and less attention has been paid to the third pillar, the pillar concerning the access to remedy. For this reason, the third pillar has been sometimes described as being the forgotten pillar. So thanks to Professor Ramasastry for having raised these kind of issues. Now let's turn to the message from Fabrizio Petri.
Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Fabrizio Petri. I'm the president of the Italian Inter-ministerial Committee for Human Rights. And I'm particularly happy to be here today with you. And I would like to thank you, our friends that organized this third edition of the Business Human Rights Summer School. We know it's made by 4 institutions: the Human Rights International Corner, the University of Milan, the National Research Council, and the University of Wageningen. So thank you to all of them. Thank you to my friends Marta Bordignon. Thank you to my friend Marco Fasciglione and all the others. Really, I think that it's wonderful that you have reached this third edition, that you're able to organize this third edition, notwithstanding the situation, the difficult situation in which we are. And thank you again for inviting me. Of course, I'm particularly pleased because in the committee that I'm president of, the Inter-ministerial Committee on Human Rights of the Ministry of External Affairs of Italy, is very involved since a long time in the issues of business human rights. We were among the first countries to to adopt a national plan. That was in December 2016. We had 2 years of consultation with civil society, with other administration, and after 2 years of work, we were able to release the national plan in December 2016. At the time, we were at the 9th country. Today, I think we are more than 20, 22 or 25. But in 2018, Italy and the Inter-ministerial Committee for Human Rights, we were the first to undergo a mid-term review of the plan. It took us an entire year. We had to listen to more than 80 voices, all the major stakeholders, from enterprises to civil societies to syndicates and so on, to human rights defenders and so on and so forth. And after 80 voices and after almost 1 year of work, we were able to re-edit the national plan. That was only a midterm review, so was not changing the structure of the plan, but was really a very important work. We were able to advance and to focus and to ameliorate the plan. This work was also very appreciated by the United Nations, and that year, in November, we went to the forum, the annual forum on business human rights in Geneva, to explain in a plenary session to all the other member states the work that we did and to do the midterm review. I would like even to say that also the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Madame Bachelet, in the recent letter that she sent to our government at the conclusion of the third cycle of the Universal Periodic Review, we just finished in March, she mentioned in her letter, among the things that she was very happy that Italy did, the fact that we did the midterm review of the Business Human Rights National Action Plan. So we are really trying to push the agenda in Italy of the Business Human Rights National Plan, and we are very happy for this reason to be involved with this summer school, because it's an occasion for us to make sure that our message, our ideas, our approach, our commitment is understood by people that are very, very, very much involved in the field, both Italians and foreigners. More in general, we are also witnessing an important development in the business human rights field. Last year, when I was again in Geneva in November to the forum, it was already clear that so far half of the countries that have national plans on business human rights represents already half of the world commerce. And what is even more interesting is that countries from all over the world are starting to adopt national plans. Not only European countries, not only American countries, like so far it was, but now Asian countries like Japan, Thailand, Korea, India are starting to deliver their own national plans, and also African countries. So it's becoming really a global instrument. We know that it's very important, this approach, because so far is the only instrument, even though it's a voluntary instrument, is the only instrument that we have to try to build a structure, to try to turn business into something more and more ethical, business and human rights. So it's very important that the idea of business human rights and the idea of the national plan is becoming really a global idea. Also, we think that it is important to always remember that the business human right is something connected with, is a transversal, cross-cutting issue, is connected with several aspects of our life, both as nations and as international community. We are referring to the 2030 agenda, of course, and already in 2016, when our plan, the Italian plan, was adopted by the Inter-ministerial Committee for Human Rights, we were really trying already to establish a strong link with the agenda that at the time was just released. So the 2030 agenda on one side, and on the other, the environmental issues. But even more general, I think that we must never forget that we are speaking about way to rethink capitalism as it was developing in the last decades. So it's very important that this is an instrument of self-consciousness, and it's not a case that at the beginning, especially where European and North American and South American countries that were developing this, because it's a step we believe it's a step in the reflection, in trying to rethink the economic system. In Italy, we decided to keep the name of the plan as Business Human Rights National Plan. But we know that our other countries choose to say not business human rights, but economy and human rights. Nevertheless, besides the names that we give to the plan, the whole idea is that we are speaking about economy at large. In fact, the Italian National Plan, that has more than 50 measures, almost 60, it's very, there is really a big variety of issues that are touched by the plan. So it's, of course, it's business, but again, it would be better to say it's economy at large. And I believe that a moment like the one now, to go back to your school, to the program and to your week that you're just about to finish, I think that moment like this, moment in which you try to understand better and to go deep into this matter, are very important. I'm very sorry that this year we could not be all together physically, because I remember the years before, it was very interesting also for us as institution, also for me, to understand certain issues, to understand certain sensibilities that professors, human rights activists, institutions are bringing to the summer school. So this year, unfortunately, is not possible, but I look forward to see what will be possible to be seen of the recording session, of documents that will be released, because every aspect of business human rights is important, and in moments like this, like a week like this, the Business Human Rights Summer School, are moments in which certain issues can be better understood. So again, thank you for having me today. Really, congratulations again to the 4 institutions that are running the Business Human Rights Summer School. I think, I may say, that the Business Human Rights Summer School organized in Italy is becoming a best practice internationally. And this is very, very important. And really, I hope that in future there will be more and more occasion to meet and to discuss issues that are becoming really important every day more in our lives. Thank you again.
Many thanks also to Fabrizio Petri for his video message. I have to say that Fabrizio Petri has always encouraged us in the organization of the summer school since the beginning of this journey, since the first edition. So I want to thank Fabrizio for having led the committee, the Inter-ministerial committee, partnering with us in this training initiative. Now let's turn to the panel of the this roundtable. We have decided to devote this roundtable to business and human rights in a COVID-19 era. The choice of this topic relies in the fact that, according to us, it was not possible speaking of business and human rights today during the turmoil caused by the coronavirus crisis without focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on the business and human rights debate. As you know, COVID-19 crisis has had an impact on multiple rights of specific categories of individuals. Let's think to the right to health of workers all along the supply chains. Let's think also to the protection of rights of vulnerable categories, such as migrants, workers, which may not have granted health care assurance in case of contagion. Summing up, COVID-19 has had an impact on human rights also within business organizations, and in order to face it, it is necessary to activate and conjugate shared responsibility from states, from companies, and from other actors operating on the international arena. We are going to discuss these issues with some friends of us who are also among the major experts in business and human rights, and who are leading the debates on these broad issues. Let me introduce them very quickly. Humberto Cantù Rivera is professor of the School of Law of the University of Monterrey in Mexico. He is director of the Human Rights and Business Institute in that university. Humberto is deeply involved in the business human rights movement in Mexico, but also within general American human rights regional system. He is author of several papers and articles on business and human rights. He is member of the editorial board of the Business and Human Rights Journal, which is one of the leading journals on business and human rights. I and my colleague, me and my colleagues are very happy having Humberto. We tried to organize also a presence of Humberto in the former edition of the summer school, but it was not possible to finalize it. Today we are proud to host him. Claudia Saller is the coordinator of the European Coalition for Corporate Justice, the well-known network of 19 member organizations across Europe advocating for binding rules on corporate accountability. She is a member of the advisory board of the European Parliament Working Group on Responsible Business Conduct, and therefore she is deeply involved in the European debate on business and human rights, on the development of a mandatory human rights due diligence instrument within the European Union level. So thank you, Claudia, for being with us. Going on, Livio Sarandrea. Livio is legal advisor and manager of UNDP project on business and human rights in Asia, promoting responsible business practices through regional partnership. This project, which is supervised by Livio Sarandrea, focuses on the implementation of the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights in 7 Asian countries. So Livio is in a perfect position in order to provide us the point of view from Asian countries. Livio is a human rights lawyer with over 20 years of field experience in the Southeast Europe, Africa, and Asia. So also to Livio goes our thanks, thanks for being with us today. Finally, Andrea Shemberg is another distinguished member of the faculty of the summer school. She's one of the major worldwide experts on business and human rights and on the UNGPs. From 2007 to 2011, Andrea has served as legal advisor of the United Nations Special Representative on Business and Human Rights, John Ruggie. So Andrea knows the secrets of underlining the development and the implementation of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. At the moment, Andrea serves as chair of the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights. She's really an international lawyer with specific specialization on stabilization clauses and human rights. She has led the realization of principles for responsible contracts. So also to Andrea, many thanks for being with us. Each of you have 10 minutes for your presentations, for your speeches. After that, I will pose you a question. And after, we will open the floor to the audience for the question and answer. Priority will be given to participants that have been enrolled in of course, in the summer school. Please, you are encouraged to put your questions directly to our speakers by booking, of course, in the Zoom chat. If the time remains, we will be glad to accept also questions from Facebook participants, Facebook viewers, as we are in streaming on Facebook also. My question for all you four is the following. As you will know, the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights has launched recently the project United Nations Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights and 10. The idea is to understand how move further in the future decade of global implementation on business and human rights towards. Now, also have in mind the recent pandemic crisis, my answer is, my question is, which kind of issue, which kind of business and human rights issue do you think are mostly in need to be focused in the future 10 years? So please, go on with your speech in the first place, and then the answer to my question. Humberto, you are the first one.
Thank you very much, Marco. And first of all, thank you, Angelica, Marco, Marta, and Chiara for this invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. And of course, I look forward to meeting you very soon in person, hopefully. I'm very glad to join you today. And I have titled my talk, A New Point of Departure, Some Reflections on a New Global Economy, where I would like to share some insights and thoughts on a new road that must be traveled in an uncertain time, with an uncertain scope, with a different and difficult political context, and with a new global economy on the basis of international obligations. To that sense and to that end, I will divide my speech in two separate parts, one addressing the transformative role of the state, number one, and secondly, the adaptative role for the business sector. Since 1945, states embarked in a quest for development and security within the framework of international law. Since 1948, with the American Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Man and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the focus turned to state obligations for the realization of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. But the Universal Declaration inescapably set forth general duties on everyone to ensure the common welfare of society by respecting the human rights of others. This was, of course, ratified in 1966 through the adoption of the Twin Covenants, which generally set forth the obligations to respect and ensure, which includes an obligation to protect human rights and to progressively realize human rights of an economic, social, and cultural nature within the extent of their available resources. In its 1980 report, and this is addressing Anita Ramasastry's remark, the Intergovernmental Working Group on a Code of Conduct clearly made a point that is still significant today, that transnational corporations should respect human rights and the fundamental freedoms in the countries where they operate. This, of course, was a point of departure that would be reiterated 31 years later in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. For almost 9 years now, the mantra has been that states should protect human rights from the negative impacts of business activities through legislation, regulation, and adjudication. Most of the response, however, has come in the form of public policies, which set the stage for discussion and capacity building, but not necessarily for transformative action. However, as globalization was suddenly forced to pause, states have also been forced to take a step back and look at their own foundations and rationale on the one hand, and those of the international human rights regime on the other hand. With the economic collapse that started to take place in February 2020, states were facing a difficult question: how to protect human life? The answer, as we know, was not simple. Protect human life itself, or protect the economy. In most cases, the choice made by states with strong social security systems was to protect human life at the expense of the economy. Other states have been less successful, either as a result of their disbelief on economic, social, and cultural rights, or their inability to develop strong social rights regimes. An important question for the state is how to rebound from this complex situation, regardless of whether their initial choice was to give preference to the economy or to the life and well-being of their population. It is apparent that in order to move forward from this global economic pause, states will need to focus on achieving the progressive realization clearly stipulated in the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. In that regard, two elements seem absolutely essential. Number one, the influence of the state in shaping responsible business practices in the economic reactivation that will be necessary in the coming months and years, especially by ensuring that the economic conditions are adequate to spur job growth, economic development, and social security with a marked human rights lens. And two, through its role as an economic actor, both internally, including through public policies and other administrative acts, such as its public procurement practices, the conduct of state-owned enterprises, and the privatization of services, and externally, as trade and investment agreements are negotiated or reviewed. This is what I would like to refer to as a state duty to foster sustainable business conduct that will require a triple effort based on legislation, guidance, and incentives. If the state, as it was argued, has a duty to foster sustainable business conduct, it is at this very moment when the different roles that business can play in society become evident. For many years, business enterprises, even those that are part of transnational corporate groups with specific practices in this regard, have spoken and continue to speak about social responsibility. That is very marked, of course, in Latin America, for example. There is nothing wrong with social responsibility, with the exception of the difference in focus based on risk prevention rather than just on social contribution. And this is not just at the corporate level. The EU has just recently started a transition from a CSR focus, defined in 2001, to an RBC focus. The difference is precisely that, risk prevention. The Special Representative on Business and Human Rights said this very clearly. Corporate good deeds do not substitute preventive action. This was largely translated into the second pillar of the UNDPs through a specific multi-stage methodology that involves proactive measures by companies to identify, prevent, mitigate, and remedy human rights risks. They were framed as a social expectation, but a close analysis of the terms of the responsibility to respect, and especially of its preventive dimension, have a largely existent legal foundation through tort law or extra-contractual liability. While not identical, they summarize Article 29 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that in the exercise of rights, there is a responsibility not to harm the rights of others. This is an important element to consider, given that this has been a hard and long battle in the quest for corporate accountability for human rights abuses. But the COVID-19 pandemic has brought to light that there is ample room for both CSR and RBC, as long as they don't substitute one another. Allow me to share an example. Many companies transformed their work at the beginning of the pandemic to produce essential goods that could be useful to combat the spread of the disease. It represents a classic case of corporate social responsibility, where a company voluntarily commits to contribute to a cause that it deems relevant for the community, for its own business, or to a combination of both. However, in many cases, as the Business and Human Rights Research Center has been reporting, some businesses took advantage of the context to engage in questionable business practices, notably in labor rights abuses contrary to what is expected of them, both under the UNDPs and in many cases under domestic and international law. This, of course, without addressing in detail the undue burden on women and other vulnerable populations, including migrants. This, in my view, clearly marks what is expected to take place in the future in this adaptive capacity and resilience of businesses. A clear idea of human rights risk prevention that is expanding its roots through normative developments in Europe and through judicial decisions in both the old continent and Latin America, and an expectation of their contribution to the fulfillment of human rights, notably through its CSR practices. This double role is what I'd like to call the corporate contribution to human rights. I would like to share two thoughts to conclude. First, that human rights should be integrated in corporate DNA by design. It is clear to me, however, that without normative development at the national, regional, and international level, only a few will continue to engage in this process, while many will continue to work through a CSR lens. Business enterprises have an adaptive capacity that can truly make them important contributors to the fulfillment and realization of human rights, something that should be achieved while ensuring their actual respect of human rights in their activities or business relationships. And second, of course, states will have an enormous role to play in the economic recovery through legislation, regulation, and guidance, but also through incentives that foster sustainable business practices in a new global economy. Thank you very much. And I don't know if I should respond to your question right now. Yeah, good. So very quickly, what comes to my mind in terms of UNDP's +10, and this is something I discussed with the UN Working Group a few weeks back, remedy. As we have already mentioned, the third pillar dimension is the forgotten pillar. I'm not sure it's entirely forgotten. I think it's maybe entirely misunderstood. And we have so many things already in place, already in motion, already in judgments especially, that I believe if we focus on expanding the understanding of that, not just between, of course, the nucleus of business and human rights practitioners, but beyond that, it will be clearly visible how there are so many things that have already been addressed through judicial decisions or through other mechanisms that would be useful to clarify where we are in terms of the state of remedy.
Thank you, Humberto. Thank you very much. Yes, I share your position as far as the pivotal role which is played by states in developing in implementation of the business and human rights framework. Thank you very much. It is an honor having you with us. And now, Claudia, the floor is Claudia Saller. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marco. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this closing panel with the title Business and Human Rights in the COVID-19 Era. And indeed, it feels a bit like an era now that so many things we took for granted are put in question and have changed. And we were also uncertain how this dramatic and unexpected arrival of a pandemic would impact our call for mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. It's a call brought forward by ECCJ since 2006. And for those of you who don't know ECCJ so well, as Marco already said, we are a membership-based organization. We have 19 member organizations from 16 European countries, themselves being mostly civil society coalitions, and again, representing almost 500 civil society organizations such as NGOs working on development, human rights, environment, etc., but also consumer organizations, trade unions, and academic. All of them working on corporate accountability and how to better regulate corporate behavior in order to ensure the respect for human rights and the environment. And we are their voice in Brussels. So talking about Brussels, when the European Commissioner for Justice, Didier Reynders, announced a legislative initiative for a European directive on human rights and environmental due diligence, he emphasized that the need for corporate justice has become even more urgent now that Europe is affected by a health, economic, and social crisis triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a pandemic that has devastating impact on human rights in developing countries, not only in developing countries, but those are the most vulnerable. And a pandemic laying bare how fragile our economic model is in general. And committed not to postpone this initiative, the Commissioner emphasized also that, first of all, voluntary business initiatives or multi-stakeholder initiatives to respect human rights are not enough. We have enough proof now to safely say that. He sees the COVID crisis as an additional trigger to go ahead with this now and fast. And it will be part of both the European Green Deal and the European Recovery Plan. So it sounds like the Commission understands that in order to get out of this economic crisis and to ensure a new model of sustainable economy, we need this kind of legislation. So more concretely, in September, the formal procedure for an EU-wide legislation on human rights and environmental due diligence will start with a formal stakeholder consultation on corporate due diligence and corporate governance. And then in March 2021, we should see a first Commission proposal on the table. In addition, we think that recovery plans and corporate bailouts need to include as a condition the obligatory conduct of human rights and environmental due diligence. Relying on cheap and unsafe labor in order to satisfy the EU market has shown to be not only highly unethical, but also high risk for business, consumers, and workers. So I would like to make 2 points here about what COVID-19 clearly revealed. First of all, it revealed that unregulated global supply chains contributed to the outbreak of the pandemic. And second, unregulated global value chains worsened the effect and the impact of the pandemic. Looking more in detail at the first point, unregulated global value chains contributed to the outbreak of the pandemic. We have research that suggests that outbreaks of animal-borne and other infectious diseases such as Ebola, SARS, bird flu, and now COVID-19 are on the rise. Increasingly, these kind of diseases are linked to deforestation, climate change, and biodiversity loss, which create the conditions for new viruses and diseases to arise and spread. And I would like to mention a detail on this which struck me the most. It's not directly linked to COVID, but still. So mosquito species carrying human pathogens are twice as common in deforested areas compared to intact forests. And of course, global warming doesn't help. On the contrary, it's expected to accelerate the emergence of new viruses. And on top of that, research has also found a strong correlation between air pollution and higher mortality rates for COVID-19 patients, as air pollution can cause hypertension, diabetes, and respiratory diseases, conditions linked to the higher risk for more serious complications from COVID-19. So what does all this mean for business? It means that businesses must identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for environmental impacts that drive disease. It also means that protecting forests, natural ecosystems, and the environment by holding businesses to higher sustainability standards also, and even more importantly, with respect to the global value chains, will ultimately reduce the risk of future pandemics. Concerning the second point, unregulated global value chains worsened the effect and the impact of the pandemic in various ways. What is, I think, undisputed is that the COVID-19 crisis has illustrated how interconnected our world is. It has shown the high degree of global interdependency of our economies and therefore the vital need for a global cooperation. The outbreak of the pandemic led to the breakdown of global supply chains. First, the sudden closure of factories in China led to a shortage of raw materials. And later, a sharp drop in demand from the West led to the termination of orders, the closure of factories, and the layoff of workers in production countries. So this ripple effect through global supply chains has exposed the lack of preparedness and resilience of this interconnected economy. Production processes and supply chains have become so complex and intransparent. Companies and governments have effectively lost oversight. There is an evident need for better mapping and risk management to build resilience into global supply chains. Having said that, we hear a lot about making supply chains more resilient, but it is important to highlight that this resilience must not exclusively concern the security of the business and its products, but it must be understood as an empowerment for those women and men, workers and children throughout the supply chain who have little chance to claim their rights or access justice. They have no means to become more resilient as long as business is solely driven by short-term profit maximization. As a consequence of the brutal decline in demand from big corporations, millions of supply chain workers have been laid off without a social safety net. In the global north, affected workers are usually, to some degree at least, protected by state aid for temporary unemployment or social security measures, but also here we can still improve. But most workers in the global south lack any financial support, either from their employers or from their governments. So again, what does this mean for business? Business must recognize and exercise the duty of care for all workers in their value chains. Western companies must work with their suppliers and business partners to ensure that adequate hygiene, health, and safety measures are adopted and adjusted to the circumstances in workplaces. That workers are provided support during quarantine situations or business shutdowns. That they are allowed to take paid sick leave without repercussions, and that wages already earned, for example, for producing goods that have been ordered, that those wages are also paid. Human rights and environmental due diligence legislation should ideally improve both prevention and remedy. So when we look at remedy, we think that a legal obligation for businesses to take their responsibility to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for potential and actual human rights abuses and environmental harm in their global value chains could serve to not only better prevent against future pandemics or global crises by tackling their environment-related causes, but it could also better respond to future pandemics or global crises by mitigating any resulting human rights impact especially in the lower tier of the global supply chains, where workers and communities are particularly vulnerable. And COVID showed that drastic measures by governments, also with an impact on business, are possible when the urgency is recognized. Looking at the remedy angle, we need improved access to remedy for victims of corporate abuse, as has been already mentioned. Access to effective remedy, including judicial remedy, must be ensured for victims of corporate abuse in global value chains. EU businesses must be held liable for human rights abuses resulting of the failure to take adequate due diligence measures. Remedy is even more needed under the current circumstances for the so-called frontline workers all along the global value chains, providing essential services and products. They and their families must have a right to remedy for failures to undertake preventive measures. And I'm thinking here especially of the workers in Malaysia who produce medical gloves that are so urgently needed now in this crisis in hospitals, but also in households. But those workers produce these gloves under slavery-like conditions. It's a shame that we are still accepting this. So in conclusion, COVID-19 gives us many reasons for working towards binding legislation for businesses to conduct human rights and environmental due diligence. And in order to respond to your question, Marco, I think that in the coming 10 years, we will need to make sure, first of all, that we have a good legislative framework. We have seen that voluntary measures are not enough. We really need the legal side of things to be adequate and appropriate. We need a legislative framework, first of all, on human rights and environmental due diligence on the 3 levels: at national level, at member state level, in all European member states, but also outside of the EU, at European level. And we need a UN binding treaty on business and human rights. And these 3 levels then can very effectively work together. They need to complement each other and be aligned with each other. And the benchmark will always be to what extent we improved remedy for victims. I think it will hopefully not take 10 years to get this legislation, but it will take some years to negotiate all of that. And to effectively implement it and readjust where necessary, and to effectively test, and then not only focus on due diligence is a very important starting point, obviously, but we also need to make sure that other measures that allow better access to justice across borders are also put in place for effective enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Very, very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. Yes, of course, the hope of everybody's trying to reach as soon as possible a legal framework, at the very least at the European level, as far as mandatory human rights due diligence. It will be necessary some years, we all suppose, but the topic of the moment is, of course, for sure this one. Going further on, Livio Sarandrea. Livio, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being with us.
Sure, thank you, Marco. Let me start, like all the other speakers, by thanking very much all the co-organizers. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. As you have illustrated before, I've been working for more than 7 years now on business and human rights, and I've done so always outside my country, which is Italy, like many might have guessed from my name. So it's really a pleasure for the first time to engage with Italian institutions. I would have very much liked to be there with you. I know last year there was an attempt also for me to be there. It didn't work. Maybe hopefully it will work soon, next year. And it will be a pleasure to meet you, Marta and Chiara. Again, kudos to all of you for organizing this summer school. As you mentioned, I spent the last 5 years of my life in Asia. So whatever I will be saying is informed mostly by my experience in Asia. So I spent the last 5 years, but certainly I spent all the pandemic crisis period here in Asia. So, and I spent it working on business and human rights. So again, the points that I will be making are informed mostly by my experience, not only from Bangkok, where I am staying, but all the other countries that I'm working with. By the way, by the time I wrote the bio that you were referring to, the number of countries we work with has grown. We are now working in 11 countries here in Asia. And indeed, since a couple of weeks, I'm now working globally on business and human rights. But again, let me go back to the subject of the discussion today, the COVID-19 and what we have seen here. I'll try to approach it, if you like, on a pillar by pillar basis. By now, I'm sure that all the students are very familiar with the 3 pillars, and perhaps counterintuitively, let me start with pillar 2. Let me start with the responsibility of the companies. So here in Asia, and in East Asia, where I'm based, is where the pandemic started. But it's also interestingly the part of the world probably where the pandemic is somehow more under control. So we have now entered in East Asia the so-called phase of recovery, fully into the recovery. In South Asia, the story is different. Of course, we've seen peaks of pandemic now in India, in Pakistan, and in Bangladesh, unfortunately. But here in Asia, we have witnessed, if you like, the 3 phases of the pandemic: the preparation to it, the response to it, and the recovery to it. Okay, so we really are looking at it as a continuum. And of course, we are looking also at the opportunities to prepare again if a second wave is there. So what have we noticed in these 3 phases? We have noticed a mix of practices. I like to start with those practices that are less common, of good companies. And there have been some good companies that tried not to lay off their employers, and they try to pay daily wages, even going through very hard times. And it's important to know that there are some companies that made that effort. But unfortunately, as we all know, in Asia, like in the rest of the world, most of the companies, unfortunately, resorted to cost cutting, the prioritizing, if you like, human rights to protect their economy, to protect their bottom line. And, you know, I'm sure you've all accessed a very worrying number, like I think I read yesterday, the last from ILO, up to 400 million jobs that can be lost, 70% of which are actually in Asia. And very importantly here, perhaps I'm introducing a new aspect that hasn't been mentioned before. There is in Asia 1.3 billion people that work in the informal sector. And these are the ones that have been hit the most from the pandemic. And it's a subject that I would like to introduce into the discussion. So again, we have seen in Asia some companies that have resorted to, to good practices, like preparing hotels for medical use, or switching manufacturing to do masks and PPE, some good practices. But again, most of these practices go back to those practices that we would call corporate social responsibility. Again, it's been said by virtually every person that spoke before me, corporate social responsibility is a very different thing than business and human rights. It's not necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, of course, it's very welcome from companies to put their money into constructing schools, or in this case is helping hospitals. However, it's a very different thing. What we have unfortunately not seen enough of is the true business and human rights, is the human rights due diligence, is their approach of looking at the risks that they can cause to abuse rights of people and addressing them and remedying them. This is unfortunately something that we haven't seen enough. An example of this was mentioned by Claudia that spoke before me. It's a story, of course, that here in Asia had a strong impact of the biggest company that produces gloves, and that has seen, I think, their production tripled. So even their profit tripled during the time of COVID-19, where more gloves were necessary. Now, this has led to longer working hours, has led to those workers, often migrant workers from Bangladesh or from Nepal, sleeping in dormitories with no social distance, has led effectively to human rights abuses. And this is obviously something that cannot be tolerated. So what do we expect? So these are examples of things that happen, but what do we actually expect from companies to do in times of COVID-19? What we expect is essentially the same three things that we expect from companies to do in all times. We expect them to do human rights policy, that perhaps look at times of emergency as well. We expect them to do human rights due diligence. We expect them to engage in remediation. But obviously, this human rights due diligence and all these three phases needs to be looked at with a different lens, with the lens of the crisis, with the lens of greater risks. One way that I that I like to put it, and I've had this discussion precisely with Anita, Ramasastry, and other members of the working group. To me, let's say that this is something that perhaps is a gap in the UNGPs. They don't necessarily address times of emergency like this. What the UNGPs do, for example, address times of conflict, right? So UNGP 7 that looks at enhanced human rights due diligence, where the business and human rights needs to be looked at in the context of fragile states. Now, for me, in a way, mutatis mutandis, of course, we need to look at emergencies like the pandemic, or emergencies that will be induced by the climate change, for example, as similarly time of crisis that require enhanced human rights due diligence from companies. So this is the way we've been discussing it with companies, and I must note that though unfortunately the negative cases abound, there's been a number of companies that actually have been willing to try to do their best, and those companies that have been trying to look at their risks and turn to us, UNDP, among others, perhaps, and asked for a tool to help them identifying what the risks are, to unpack, if you like, the risks during time of COVID-19. And this is why we have actually produced a specific tool, which is called Human Rights Due Diligence and COVID-19. I'll show it here. I will post the link in the chat so that the students can download it, where we unpacked the risks, the human rights risks in time of COVID-19 into 42 points, divided again into times of prepare, response, and recover. So we're trying to illustrate in here what companies should be doing in these three phases, which again can unfortunately be in a cycle. After the recovery, there may be another phase of prepare, another phase of respond, and again another phase of recovery. I'm not going into details because actually some of the points that we have included in there were already pointed out by those who spoke before me. And I want to make sure I have enough time to cover your question, which is very interesting, Marco. So that's for pillar 2. Let me quickly go into pillar 1. What are our expectations from governments then? The expectations from governments, I spend most of my work is to deal with governments, and most recently I met during the pandemic and a bit before with the government of Thailand, Pakistan, Mongolia. And I've articulated my own views and recommendations into 3 points, essentially. What companies should be making, what governments should be making in time of COVID-19. Number 1, lead by example, right? That's UNGP 4. They should always be leading by example, but leading by example in times of COVID-19 means looking at their state-owned enterprises and making sure that their state-owned enterprises don't violate, don't abuse human rights in times of COVID-19. So set an example. Second thing they should be doing, using their policy documents, NAPs, the National Action Plan, if possible, or any other policy, to introduce specific reference to times of emergencies like the one of COVID-19. One such country is Mongolia. I spoke recently with Thailand and Mongolia. Thailand already completed the National Action Plan. It's adopted, so they will now come up with an addendum to it. And we are actually helping them in doing an addendum to their National Action Plan. Mongolia is drafting their National Action Plan right now. So they also asked for our support. There will be most likely a chapter within their new National Action Plan that will look at emergencies. I cannot look at any new NAP being adopted in the coming years, not having a chapter that looks at emergencies of whatever type, not necessarily only health emergencies. Third thing that they should be doing, that I personally expect governments to do, is to expect even stricter application of human rights due diligence from companies that access funding from the government. We all know that in many countries, companies that are in crisis, because of course they suffered out of the pandemic, are receiving grants, are receiving support from the governments, and by all means they should. This is a good practice. However, it is my opinion that if a government puts some public money, some taxpayers' money into helping a company recover, should have an expectation that that company guarantees that rights are protected. Okay, so that expectation I think really should be there. Very quickly on Pillar 3, as again Claudia said, there's even greater need for remedies during the time of emergency, where there is an enhanced risk, if you like. We have conducted 2 surveys, one of national human rights institutions and one of CSOs working on supporting rights holders. And in both cases, we have seen that these institutions have had less opportunity to protect people, less claims received by national human rights institutions, for example, simply because people in lockdown could not go and submit their complaints with the national human rights institutions, especially where technology couldn't help. I was in a webinar last week where the national human rights institutions of Europe told us that actually they received a lot more claims through applications, through telephones and so on. Now, there are countries where people do not have the same access to technology the European countries have. Those countries have seen less cases in a scenario where we all agree there probably have been a lot more complaints, sorry, a lot of more abuses. So we need to be very conscious of that. I'll conclude by saying that because of this, because Pillar 3 is the forgotten pillar, not so forgotten anymore, but still enough forgotten, we have decided to focus, to double our work from this year on working with CSO and national human rights institutions, which lead me to the last point, which connects to those made by others and connects to the question that you posed, Marco. The next decade of business and human rights. I'm very honored by the fact that the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights decided to partner on the drafting of the roadmap with UNDP and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So we already started working even in the very concept of the next decade. And the first thing that I want to stress is that the project is on the next decade of business and human rights, not the next decade of UNGPs. And that's an important nuance to place in there, right? So, and I go back to the issue of the smart mix. Let me mention, as you were posting the questions, I was trying to jot down some recommendations and I quickly jotted down 10. I promise I won't take 10 more minutes, but let me just list them quickly for you. Number one, UNGPs in times of crisis. I said it before, I think this is not well addressed in the UNGPs. You know, we should unpack what business and human rights means in times of crisis. Not only the pandemic, but again, any crisis induced by climate change that unfortunately is at the horizon. Number two, I think the very UNGP 7 on times of conflict should be unpacked further. The report from the working group presented in October will open up the discourse, and I think should be unpacked further. Similarly, the issue of business human rights and corruption is another issue should be unpacked further during the next decade. And third is climate change. These are, by no coincidence, three of the subjects that the working group is working on right now on 3 reports. So I expect the next decade to unpack what these 3 reports are going to look at. Fourth, I had the forgotten pillar, enough has been said on that. Fifth, informal sector. There's too little was done on addressing business and human rights in the informal sector that in some part of Asia and Africa and many others is a huge, huge problem. Sixth, we should look at benchmarks, something like what the CHRB is doing, corporate human rights benchmark, but recognizing the limitations of that instrument, come up with benchmarks that include stakeholders' views. I'm almost done. We should try to make sure there is the right balance, the right smart mix, the right balance of the smart mix of voluntarily and mandatory. I am in favor, of course, of mandatory legislation. I am also in favor of having voluntary principles alongside those. Like Anita said, it's not either or, it's definitely both, because unfortunately we've had also many binding treaties at the UN that are not being respected. So there must be a way also to convince, if you like, companies that that's the right way to go. Last one must be the decade of action, the SDGs. We're looking at the next 10 years, which coincide more or less completely with the last decade of the 2030 agenda. So the roadmap for the next decade must tie its targets very strictly with the 2030 agenda. I'll leave it at that. I hope I haven't gone much beyond the time that was assigned to me. Thank you, Marco.
Thank you to you, Livio, for having painted this illuminating framework. So thank you very much. Last but not the least, Andrea Shemberg. Andrea, please, the floor is yours. Only to remember for the participant to start to book in the chat, in the Zoom chat, in order to put their questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. First, I wanted to just congratulate the students because I read your bios and it's an amazing group you have. So I was so impressed, and I'm also very hopeful for the future of the world reading your biographies. So congratulations to the HRIC team for putting this together. I'm really proud to be part of this school. One small caveat, I am chair of the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights. I wear several hats, and I can talk to you about GBI if you want to ask questions about it, but my remarks today are really made in my personal capacity. They're reflections that I've observed about company behavior and the human rights risks of COVID, and how I read the situation from the standpoint of the UNGPs. So in my few minutes, I'll touch on a couple of things. I'm going to take part of my talk away, which was describing what the UNGPs expect of companies during COVID. I think other speakers did touch on that, and the difference between CSR and BHR, and we can talk about that in the questions. But let me get right to the meat, which is giving you some examples from my experience of the kind of human rights risks that we're observing. And you heard before, actually, of a number of those risks, but then I'd like to tell you about some of the innovative things that companies have done for addressing those risks. But then where I'd really would like to focus is where I see a lot of the challenges within company practice, and this leads then to where we need to go for the next 10 years. So let me just scroll down for my notes. So we heard before, what are the risks that we're seeing, right? So migrant workers, we saw in Bangladesh, migrant workers let go, and also in India, no transport home, no housing, no benefits, then called back, but left homeless for 2 weeks while they wait for factories to open up. We saw people worldwide losing work without insurance, unemployment benefits. It was mentioned earlier, the number of people that are in informal work, and between 70 and 80% of workers in India, for example, are in the informal economy, and so have nothing if they lose their work. In other parts of the world and in other types of work, we've seen people enter into depression, anxiety, problems of domestic abuse, with families staying at home and working, but yet having all the pressure of childcare and other commitments. We've seen work hours increasing, and even industry associations giving the kind of green light to increasing work hours up to 72 hours a week in factories. We've seen unsafe living conditions, and in Singapore at one point a few weeks ago, the contagion was growing fastest in the worker and housing for factory workers. And we have people who maybe in terms of social distancing, they should be maybe 6 people in a house, and we've seen up to 20. And then one of the issues we also saw was seafarers. So we saw people literally stranded on their ships and not able to dock anywhere. And then people forced to continue to work because they have no sick leave. And even in countries like, well, in all countries, but also in countries like the United States, where you have many workers without union representation, without sick leave, and they're independent kind of consultants, delivery drivers, etc. I live in Bologna, Italy, and in my town last week, the warehouse of couriers in one of the company courier warehouses, there were 46 new cases of COVID. So we're still seeing that. We also are seeing governments relaxing labor laws and increasing work hours. So right now, India in 7 states is discussing whether to relax certain labor laws. And the ILO has intervened in that case, and hopefully that won't be the case, but the risk is there. And then in other industries, for example, in mining, we've seen local communities very worried, especially when they're indigenous communities, very worried about mines continuing to operate and not feeling safe with outsiders coming in and coming out. So what are some of the things that I've seen in my practice with companies taking actions? So in some companies have taken some excellent, have instituted some excellent measures to support their suppliers. So that means paying early, honoring contracts. They've even offered loans and even taken equity in some places to own some of those supplier networks to ensure their supply chain. And of course, the tension always is, are you doing that for supply chain resilience, or also because you're thinking of the supplier and not having to let people go, right? So we'll get to that in a minute. We've seen some companies do a lot of wonderful things for seafarers, so negotiating, collaborating with a number of entities and governments to get people onshore into help centers where they can stay for medium periods of time, where they can get food, whereas before maybe there was a help service where they just had access to phone and computer. So they've enhanced those seafarer services. We've seen other companies, and someone mentioned it earlier, where we have these complex supply chains that sometimes are opaque to the business. We've seen now major companies saying, finally, we've got to map our supply chain. And then what's interesting is that the human rights people within those companies say, well, let's map the supply chain and also think through the human rights implications of that supply chain. One of the most interesting things that I've seen, and one of perhaps the most positive things I've seen in COVID, is a new attention to mental health. A new attention to mental health and a new empathy, even from the top of companies towards their workers. And in my work, I have contact with several companies, and across the board, that's what I've been told, is that there is a new traction internally to listen to mental health issues, to address mental health issues. They've put in enhanced measures. So there were even people in the company who would go to workers' homes and engage with them. So from the Human Resources Department or from the Human Rights Department, and go and engage with workers at home that were having trouble, and help them get involved in the in an employee program. Some companies were even offering emotional support to families of workers. So it didn't have to be the employee themselves, but to others. And I find that attention to mental health risks, I guess it took the pandemic, right, for real attention to be there and for empathy to be open and from the highest levels. But that was something that gave me quite, I received that news quite positively. I've also seen some companies really seriously concerned about the people at the ends of their value chains, at the end of the supply chain in particular. And some companies that I have spoken with have had such good human rights due diligence processes before that during COVID, now they know those 50 problematic suppliers, and they're giving special attention. But here comes the challenges. So, there is an impossibility to get people on the ground, to do worker voice, to talk with workers, to do even what we, old school audits. It's just really, you can't get people in now into the factories. And so effectively, people are more at risk now. Monitoring is just not going to be happening, is the truth of it. And also there's a challenge here, which is under the UNGPs, we say you need to prioritize your salient risks, right? You don't have to see all your human rights risks and you go at those at once. You need to prioritize where they're most salient, where they're most severe, where they're irremediable. Well, there's this tension that I've noticed with multinational companies. And the tension is, do I pay attention to my headquarters employees who are going to be let off and worry about them, as opposed to those of suppliers who are going to be risking their lives walking home and where the borders might be closed, right? So the risks are certainly more extreme in the supplier of the supplier, right? But how do you get headquarters to give resources and pay attention to those more salient risks when you've got people down your hall that are being let off? And I think that is a tension that is very hard to get over. And I think the other tension is, how do you deal with working at home and dealing with the inequalities that are going to play out among different people who may have childcare abilities, who may be single parents, et cetera? How do you deal with those inequalities as they will over time take their toll? And then kind of more practical issues I've seen. What do you do about worker housing? We know one company that I spoke with, they have very strict worker housing rules, but they know they're not being followed now. And how do you do it in a time of crisis? You can't get people in there, and you can't be demanding so much from your suppliers. So it's difficult. And then finally, someone mentioned earlier this resilience, right? And we hear so much about supply chain resilience. And I think from the UNGP's perspective, we should be thinking about human resilience. And how does your business model build human resilience from climate change, from pandemics, et cetera? And I feel like we really need a different optic there. But I'm not sure that we're there. And I've seen companies struggling with all of these tensions during the crisis. And I think, so where do we go in the next 10 years? I think, number one, the business and human rights as an understanding of that international standard, that has to be now a board level concern and a CEO concern. We have to stop being satisfied with mid-level executives pulling this, right? And in the pandemic, I've observed it's about how creative is that team? How much are they willing to knock on doors and get into conversations? Have they been included in the pandemic response team, or have they found a creative way to get their foot in the door? We can't allow such an important issue to rely on individuals and rely on mid-level executives. This now has to be a CEO issue. It has to be a board level issue. And I think one of the things we will see is more convergence now on issues. So we talked about SDGs, climate, emergency response, but pandemics, discrimination, all of those issues we're now seeing those connections. And I think government initiatives like what the EU is doing with also their sustainable finance strategy that is trying to integrate, and their new taxonomy, I don't know if you covered it this week, we could talk about it, but the new taxonomy that looks at climate, environment, and also social safeguards, I think that is the direction of travel. I think that's where we need to be going. So it's got to be state intervention, but things that get the conversation to a higher level within the companies. I think right now it's a bit stalled in this mid-level executive space where commercial prerogatives will always win. So I think that's where I would like to see things go in the next 10 years.
Many thanks, Andrea. I see that almost all of you have the same kind of perspective on the future 10 years. That is this kind of convergence among different areas, which are usually, which have been remained usually separated and fragmented. So it's a sort of defragmentation of business and human rights area. This is really important for us and very extremely relevant to our debate. Now we have the question and answer phase. Unfortunately, Claudia Saller lost her connections and she's unable to connect back again. So she is going to miss this question and answer phase. However, for participants, Claudia is able to answer your questions by email. So contact her by email in order to put her your questions. We have 5 participants' questions. The first set of questions is from Saba, Andrea, Beatrix, Jacobo, and Augustine. Please, Saba, the floor is yours. And also, Saba, and each of you specific who you want to ask the question to. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you, everyone. Yes, so, I mean, anyone could answer this question, but I'm going to target it to Livio and to Andrea just because of the content of their intervention. So previously in this course, we have heard about leverage as part of the due diligence process, especially of multinationals compared to when it comes to very salient issues. So do you believe, especially in the Corona context, the COVID context, does exercising this leverage become part of the substantive test of due diligence? So, for example, seafarers, do you believe that there is a possibility of blurring the role between countries and companies? So, you know, you have the diplomatic protection of companies. So do you believe that there is, as part of a due diligence obligation, a part to do your best effort to leverage countries to provide, for example, better social protection or labor protection? That would be my question.
Andrea, Livio?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for your talks and contributions. Over the week, the summer school lectures, we all pretty much praised the due diligence obligation, and I totally agree that it has a very strong potential. However, allow me to play devil's advocate and ask the following question to any of the panelists, in fact. Given the nature of the due diligence obligation that is understood as an obligation of conduct, doesn't this risk becoming a tool for washing policies by companies that merely want to get around their negative impact on human rights?
Andrea, who is the addressee of your question?
Any of the panelists, in fact.
Okay. Beatrice?
Sorry, can you repeat the question just one more time? I didn't catch the question. Can you repeat it one more time, please?
Sure. I said that I agree that the due diligence obligation has a strong potential. However, playing a bit the devil's advocate, I wanted to see your opinion, to hear your opinion on the following. Isn't there a risk for the due diligence obligation that is an obligation of best effort to become or to be a tool for washing policies, like greenwashing, for instance, in order for companies to get around their human rights, negative human rights impact?
Thank you, Andrea. The next one is Beatrix.
Thank you. So my question is actually closely related to Andrea's. My interest is in these auditing companies that may arise. We may have a business and human rights spin-off industry in accountability mechanisms. How do you generally, asking the panel, foresee or ensure scrupulous corporate accountability standards, given that there will be very strong incentives for these organizations to stand very close to business? Would you imagine global bodies perhaps, or further regulation of the regulators? Thank you.
The next one is Jacobo.
Thank you for the panelists for the presentation. This question is for Andrea, Humberto. Andrea mentioned that there are different reactions from firms to protect employees. Those reactions or protections will be framed as the CSR actions or human resources actions that we have seen during the course. So my question is, do we have a business like human rights theory? Is a theory, is a framework, or how would we define the tension between CSR, human resources management, human rights discipline? Thank you.
Thank you, Jacobo. Okay, thank you. And the last one is a question from Augustine.
Hi, everyone. So my question, during the course, we discussed many litigation strategies and cases, but I wonder if in fragile contexts and countries that really have challenges with law enforcement, could litigation before human rights court, let's say the Inter-American Commission or the Inter-American Court or the African Court, turn out being new forms of colonialism, in the sense that if the case is successful, then taxpayers, as Livio said earlier, taxpayers will have to pay the remedies to those communities affected by businesses that choose to operate in X or Y country, because they already know those fragile conditions. And in line with this, I read a report discussing that law firms will be cashing in on the pandemic, saying that businesses providing like basic or public services such as water or electricity or internet will sue states because of some emergency measures taken by those states, banning companies to cut out services from people that's not paying the bills. And I guess my question was for our colleague. It is not connected, so maybe I would like to have Humberto's opinion and maybe Livio's from a more like international and UN perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Agustina. So let's follow the order of the program. So Humberto, Andrea, and Livio. Humberto, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your questions, and to my co-panelists for their interesting presentations. I would like to address the second question to begin with. Was posed by Andrea Longo, I believe, on due diligence as an obligation of conduct and its use to escape obligations. It really depends on how you look at due diligence, in my view, because due diligence in itself is not even a process. I mean, it's a mindset within a company that has to be established. It's not like you just plug in a due diligence process and that's it. But if you look at it from a legal perspective, and this is something I have confirmed in a study that was prepared for ICHR in Latin America, there was a review of over 200 decisions, judicial, extrajudicial decisions, and it was very clear that from a legal perspective, companies could not escape that preventive obligation, even if there is no due diligence legislation per se. And that is very revealing to me, because it also brings to my mind, at least, this idea that maybe the focus of due diligence legislation is actually clarifying something that is already there in many legislations, in civil law, in some countries in criminal law and administrative law. So it's somehow complicated. I think we may rebound a bit more on this answer if you want to, but to my mind, it's not as easy to escape the obligation, the legal obligation itself, but it could be easily evaded if we look at it from a communication perspective, which is something that, if you look at the corporate human rights benchmark, for example, is very clearly there. Companies say they do things, and they may communicate things very well, but it's not exactly the same as complying and enforcing those standards within their own operations or their supply chains. So to my view, that's the difference we have to make, but it is a right point to make. Your question is actually very, very good. And I would probably like to address two more, if that's okay, about Jacobo's business and human rights theory, or how to cope the tensions. It actually depends a lot. And from what I've seen, I have this very frequent discussion with my brother, who is an engineer, and during, barbecues at home, we normally tend to, engage in this type of conversation. And it's very interesting that he absolutely understands everything I'm saying to him. But he says, look, I mean, the way you tell it, it's very nice and very, elaborate. But if you break it down into indicators, you will see that everything or most that you're saying is already there within the company. That doesn't mean necessarily that they engage outside of what happens within the company, so outside of their employees. But I think, well, if it's a theory, I guess it's becoming a theory. At least it's becoming a discipline in its own. And how to cope those tensions, I think it's a matter of language. And for example, one thing that is very important to introduce in university courses, for example, is this idea of how to engage with doctors, how to engage with engineers, architects, other disciplines that are not around the social sciences, because that's where most of the action will actually happen. So in my view, that's one way that we should look at to address these tensions, but it's something that of course requires time and a lot of effort. Agustina, I must confess I got a bit lost in your question, so if you can repeat it, I will try to address it.
Sorry, it was a very long one, but so it was two things. One related to if suing states for what companies do in fragile contexts in countries with lack of law enforcement could be a new form of colonialism, either suing these states before Inter-American Court, either suing these states in domestic courts, because, for example, as I mentioned, this report that is saying that businesses might start suing the governments of the states because of the measures they took during the coronavirus, saying, okay, don't cut this person from the electricity services or water services because those are things that we need for in the context of the pandemic. And now they're gonna say, no, but like that affected my business, so I want money back. Or if you go to the Inter-American Court, the African Court, and you get like a positive outcome, then the ones that are going to have to pay are, you know, the whole country, the whole people, the whole citizens. So like, I mean, the states is not something abstract.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's a very good question. And it's something that the Special Rapporteur on Economic, Social, Cultural, and Environmental Rights of the Inter-American Commission has been addressing recently, this potential risk for states that because of their lack of enforcement or adequate legislation in terms of Social Security, for example, they may be seeing some suits, some claims brought before the Inter-American Commission and then perhaps a court. I'm not entirely confident that they will succeed in terms of citizens being affected, because the Commission serves as a filter, and I am absolutely sure that they have to measure very cautiously the political pressure that may come from states. We know that the Inter-American system is running on fumes, basically. They have no money at all. And that is something that should be considered. Now, about the other part, and I believe that's more in the sense of investment arbitration, where Andrea is, of course, the very best expert there is here. There is a risk. There is a very latent risk. And I do believe that companies have to decide how to position themselves in this specific situation. It's not something that was foreseeable for states. It was absolutely outside of their management capacities. But if companies decide to position themselves on the side of human rights directly, well, in principle, they could decide not to do so. And for example, perhaps engage in some sort of negotiation with governments directly instead of going to arbitration to try to get some of the damages repaired. But on the other hand, I mean, if they have a right that they may want to exercise, it's still within their possibilities. So my view would be that it's absolutely possible that we will see many lawsuits, many arbitral claims, addressing this specific situation. And that will be, of course, very important, as you just said, for taxpayers and for the economic systems, especially of developing countries. Which brings to mind, well, what's going to happen in the UN with this new negotiations on the investor-state dispute settlement system. But I think Andrea will probably elaborate much more on that than me.
Thank you very much, Humberto. Further on, Livio, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Marco. I want to address the third question. It's the one I feel most intrigued by answering. It was the one on the auditing companies and their credibility. Yes, indeed, the credibility of many of the auditing company has been put in question, right? It is, and I was almost wondering whether there was a statement or a question. Yes, indeed, people do question the fact of an audit company being paid, to conduct an assessment and being somehow directly or indirectly feeling that it has to come up with an outcome which is positive or not as negative as it should have been. I mean, I think the point here is to try to complement, not to rely only on the auditing company to judge the performance of a company. And this is why, for example, UNDP is pushing very hard, and large part of our project goes into building watchdog capacities within civil society, within national human rights institutions, and within media. At the end of the day, what companies, especially the multinational multinationals really fear at this moment, it's the risk to their reputation. It is something, there is an example, I won't mention the company, but I can only tell you that it's the biggest, one of the biggest company that exists in the world. And I was talking to the director of human rights of this big company, and he told me, Livio, I am always one picture away from the disaster. Because if there is one picture, you know, put on a website on, you know, a certain abuse that my company is responsible for, that can instantly, you know, go around the world in a day or two and become a disaster in terms of credibility for my own company. So yes, I mean, there are some limits indeed in the auditing practices. There are some positive aspects of it. If we had to limit it only to that, yes, the limits will probably be many. But if it is part of a larger ability to monitor what companies are doing, which include also CSOs, human rights defenders, national human rights institutions that need to be given resources, ability to do that, protected for the job that they are doing, then we end up having a better picture, because essentially anybody who has a mobile phone these days can be a watchdog, can be reporting on abuses from a company. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Livio. Andrea?
Yeah, thanks. I think we're running late, so I'll be very quick. So on the first question, without getting too technical on leverage, it's an extremely important question. Can companies now, backed by the UNGPs, use their leverage in a way that's overstepping their responsibility? But what I would say to that is, before the UNGPs, we saw companies doing things like training judges in countries, right? To a human rights person like me, that's overstepping. I don't want a major oil company to be training my judges, right? So what the UNGPs did is they differentiated the roles. And so within that differentiated role, where you are caring for the impact that your company is going to have on that seafarer, for example, that is an okay use of leverage, but it has to be with respect to your impacts, right? So you've gone through, you've understood through your supplier, you're having this impact, the seafarer is out there. Now, addressing that impact is within your role, but that differentiated role between the state and the company is precisely what the UNGPs were trying in part to do. So I think, I hope that answers. On the due diligence potential for washing, I think that was a potential. I think that really was in 2011. I think the world has moved on and we're much more sophisticated about understanding what due diligence is and should look like. But we're always learning also. And the interesting thing was, when I used to work for Amnesty, you know, we could tell you what was wrong, but could we tell you what the company was supposed to be doing? Well, no one really knew what the company was supposed to be doing. But over 10 years, we've learned a whole lot. And so now I think is really the time where you can't get away with just anything, right? And now, as we also see mandatory human rights due diligence discussions in the EU and elsewhere, I think we're getting to a point where the world is a little bit more sophisticated on what due diligence looks like. And it's a little bit like in law, if any of you are lawyers, where you have the negligence concept, where at one time it wasn't negligent to not have a radio on your ship. After a certain point, it was understood to be negligent to not have a radio on your ship. So it moves in time, and our understanding of what good due diligence will also move in time. So I think that risk of being greenwashing or blue washing, whatever you call it, will always be falling. I'll skip the auditing one. On CSR and human rights, super interesting question. We need a long time to talk about it, but let me just say this. If you take sexual harassment, and it's something that I do some writing on, sexual harassment from a human resources perspective is very different from a human rights perspective. Human resources is you have an HR policy, you do some training, and you punish the bad actors. Human rights recognizes that sexual harassment is a societal problem that can either be exacerbated inside the company through power structures, the way work is organized, et cetera, or it can be countered. And so a human rights perspective on sexual harassment looks at your business model, the way work is organized, where is the power in the company, et cetera, and it doesn't pinpoint individual bad actors only. It's individual bad actors in a system that reflects societal discrimination. So we can talk more about that, but just to say that it's extremely different. And the human rights approach, I think, is much richer because we have the jurisprudence and all of the standards to rely on from the international system. Last, on Augustine's question, it's a huge problem if we're looking at international arbitration. And I think one of the most important things states could be doing now is an international agreement to not honor cases that are relying on emergency measures in COVID. Would it ever happen? I don't know, but it's going to be a huge problem. And is it a new form of colonialism? I don't know if you can characterize it that way, but I think it is a very big problem. And it's also a problem because we've got third-party litigators. So they're not even the company anymore. The company may not even be involved and worry about their reputation. It will be someone who bought that case to fight it. So I think you're right to be concerned, and I'm also very concerned about that.
Thank you very much, Andrea. We are 20 minutes more than what we had scheduled. So unfortunately, there is no more time for the other questions from the participant of the summer school. And of course, there is no more time for opening the floor to Facebook participants. However, I think that participants can contact you by email in order to ask you questions or doubts or reflect on the issue that you have dealt with today. So we are at the final greetings. I want again to say to all of you for many thanks. Many thanks for having been with us. I hope that we will have the possibility to catch back in the future, perhaps in the third edition of the summer school. So thank you very much, Andrea Shemberg, and thank you very much, Claudia Saller, and many thanks to Humberto Cantù Rivera and Livio Sarandrea. I want to mention that Livio and Humberto are supposed having been connecting today from a non-European time zone. So thank you very much for your resistance from this point of view. Thank you again, and see you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.